I wanted to also talk a bit about the idea of relational power. Working with the people I work most closely with at Waswanipi, a group of 10 to 20 people, I learned about a world that, of course, encompasses nature and animals, that bridges the gap human-animal, nature-culture, subject-object. These worlds have been reported very widely. And as I learned about relationality from hunting families, the hunting families I discussed most intensively with, it was clear how a relational world was embedded in everyday living and everyday hunting. And later, in attending village meetings related to the struggles and negotiations and responses to development, I came to see how relational worlds and relationality were embedded in relations to governments too, as the concept of co-governance captures. It slowly became clear to me that as people spoke, they were speaking about power in both hunting and government and other relationships, and that they were expressing a view of power I hadn't seen widely. I call it relational power. I came to think that it was a knowledge and practice of relational power. I expect that, it's a project I'm still developing, so I'll just outline the pattern here. When I was asking for terms for hunting, there were terms that were about anticipation, about the expected outcome of a hunt. The stories often had the structure of a hunter going through a process of finding indications of possible encounters with animals, tracks, spoor, feeding, living areas, responding with anticipation to the possible encounter. And if the animal appears at the end and the hunt is successful, fulfilling the anticipation. Many hunting stories or comments included the statement, they found what they were looking for. This understanding of hunting involves social and moral relationships, of which the outcome is the hunt, and mutual efforts of the hunter and an active environment, willful persons and animals, to bring a hunt to conclusion. This is captured in the notion of the animal as a gift, that you don't just kill an animal, you interact with it, and the result is killing. I had an experience trying to talk about this where my own ideas kept intruding. I asked the late Joe Otter, is it the animals themselves that decide if a man should catch them? At times, I can swear that animals have a feeling death is coming, or they feel it. Does an animal just give itself to the hunter? No. When he can't kill an animal he wants, does he try another way? If he didn't kill the animal the first time, he leaves it alone. If he sees it again, he tries another way. Why does that work? You leave it alone a while, he thinks that he put up a good fight. Joe, couldn't kill it, but while the animal is thinking this, Joe surprises him. To be a good hunter, then, you have to outsmart the animal? He wouldn't say that. The animals and the hunters change. He wouldn't say this would make a good hunter. Maybe this time it would, maybe another time it wouldn't. He makes changes to the different game, to each hunt. Joe's discomfort with my way of phrasing the question about outsmarting the animal was due in part to the assumption that the hunter controls that outcome. He was stressing his need to constantly adjust his hunt as it goes on, to change. And he has to be quick about it before the animal changes its mind. More generally, the ways animals were hunted, approached, killed, and carried back to camp, admired, processed, shared, consumed, and disposed of and dreamed, are all expressions of this personal relation. And the means of expressing respect and responsibility is through these actions. Hunters often get to know the specific habits and idiosyncrasies of the animals whose signs they encounter. They may get to know the animal's feeding preferences, how many young it had, what patterns of rest it uses, how it walks, what terrain it prefers to travel, how consistent its habits are. Hunters start to come to know the animals individually. And animals come to know the hunters in return. Many hunters say that they want their clothing to be attractive to animals. They want their equipment to look beautiful to animals. They have to keep it in good repair. And the implication is that this pleases the animals who know and see the hunter. Similarly, people said that they discover their understandings and their knowledge rather than create them. The insights and knowledge that come in the hunt or that people discover in everyday life, it was said by some people, come to us. They're a gift in everyday thoughts and in dreaming. The implication in these discussions was that the hunter and the knower does not control the insights. The ideas come into our heads. William Saganash, then in his 60s, told me about an encounter with a bear. He was hunting by himself alone. He was paddling himself in the evening. He built a small camp. He didn't have any sleeping bag. He couldn't sleep that night. It was too cold. He saw someone coming in, a man, a woman. A visitor, brought rabbit skin like a sleeping bag, and he covered William. The visitors got up and visitors slept in the place he was sleeping and woke up, and he was warm when they woke up. They got up and they left, and William got up right after. They got up and left. The wind was cold, and he was waiting for the wind to settle down. As the wind went down, he started walking around, and he heard some noise, like someone yelling at him. He knew where it was. He went and he looked where it was. He found a noise. He looked around and he saw a bear picking berries, and he saw that noise was a bear. The bear was yelling at him. He's walking around just himself, but he hear like people around laughing at him. But he's not human, but bear. People bear. He lived with his wife already when this happened, and he was a youth, but already married. Hunting indicates how ideas of the world are deeply embedded in the everyday practices and experience. The story implicitly explains his expressed with hunting bears as his relationships to them, not by commenting on how good a hunter is, but how close the bears and he feel with each other. Bear hunting success was a power he had. The knowledge and practice of power in this perspective differs in important ways from that common in European discourses or everyday North American societies. Conventional wisdom, modern understandings of power, power is the ability to use relationships to shape others and contexts. In this discussion, in hunting families, it emerges in relationships. Hunters explain that when he or she thinks about something, it happens, and they describe this as power. When what they think comes to be in the world, it's an expression of power. One person called it anticipatory knowledge. It's not passive, but active. It was explained to me that you're looking to find what you know, just as hunting is conceived as looking to fetch game in Adrian Tanner's comments. Future knowledge helps to actualize. The late Joe Otterise explained, when he wants to get a moose, he thinks about it. And it's as if someone is letting him know about it, where to go and what to do, and then he is sure to get it. Sometimes he dreams about it. Sometimes he hears about it, as if someone is talking to him, letting him know where to go. This is not a passive reflectiveness, but an openness to interpretation and understanding, and it's an active following up of that interpretation and anticipation in the world. It's working to find signs of gifts in the land. The power, I understood, is an emerging coincidence between the anticipation of the world that may come to be and the configuration of the world brought about by interactions with others. The congruence is the anticipation. The anticipation helps to actualize the potential. A social person who thinks and a personal environment in which he or she thinks are not separable. Power is not an individual possession. It's a view of a person that a person cannot bring to actuality, usually without the world being brought into conformity by others. Power is a social process, of thoughts and actions among many people, whereby potentiality becomes actuality. Humans are powerful in this view, insofar as their thought and actions are linked to the causes of events of others in the world. This interpretation of relational power helped me to understand many of the challenges and the relations of Cree hunters to governments and corporations. Relational power was not only grounded in hunting, but in relations and conflicts. Before turning to the political conflicts, I need to say a little bit about, returning to the relations with governments, I need to talk a little bit about abuses of power. Cree representations of power involve a category of being that's not quite human, a touche or cannibal monster, often known as Wendigo, often associated with white men, as Colin Scott pointed out. Within hours of arriving in the village at Matagami in 1968, I was adopted by a family, as I've mentioned. Within a couple of days, the youngest child in the house, who was 3 or so years old, was laying on the floor and the adults in the room pointed to me and said, a touche, cannibal monster. The child flattened herself, tried to create friction, but kept getting pushed closer and closer to me as she screamed and cried and beat her fists on the floor. This was a process of teaching people about asociality, and my discussion of my difficulties in reciprocity suggests I was particularly appropriate to do that with me. But Colin Scott shows that this metaphor of a touche is in fundamental opposition to kinsman and to kinship. It's a being who denies reciprocity, who denies sociality, an isolated, solitary creature. A touche prey on people. A touche is a metaphor and an incarnation of those who use a kind of power for extreme self-aggrandizement and to control other people. In a world where animals and humans are social beings, a touche is an asocial other, neither fully animal nor fully human, nor fully personal. The metaphor for a touche attests to the inherent ambiguity, uncertainty, and danger inherent in social relationships. It's a symbol for the possibility of negating relations, whether among animals or people. In the past, powerful Cree elders could try to protect people from the terrifying circumstances of cannibal monsters by calling on their helpers. The Atouche dealing with Atouche calls for relational power within the community and with the world of spirits. In Cree stories about the past, Atouche are humans who've gone astray often. And at least in the early stages, the efforts are to bring them back to their humanity and to their social kin. It's the drawing back into relationships that again reactivates the notion of power as social relationships and power as relational. To return to understanding developers, developers have been looked at and talked about as asocial beings. They don't desire to build social linkages. They don't need them in their view. The willingness to dialogue on the part of Cree, not to be ignored and disempowered, is expressed by building relationships even where they're being denied, ignored, and resisted. This was clear in Fort George in 1974, when the government negotiators came to the village during the course of the negotiation of the James Bay Agreement. They started off by saying that they weren't there to really negotiate. They couldn't change the project. The community insisted on a voice in what was being said, and they called for the land to be shared, not to have the project built without their involvement. It was an expression of exercising relational power. A community member said the Cree don't claim ownership and that they could share the land. The earth was not created to be destroyed, a reference to cannibal monsters. The government negotiators applied that all men destroy the land, turning them into all cannibal monsters, and denying the Cree reciprocity and the Cree caring that was expressed in the notions of sharing. The government denial turned the meeting in a more aggressive direction. Within a few minutes, people were saying, "He doesn't listen to us anywhere." An elder said, "No need for him, for the government, to answer. I have spoken the truth. It cannot be distorted. We want to preserve our land and our way of life." Another said, we know you have no love for the land or for people." In all these ways, people insisted that they were dealing with an asocial being. But what struck me as the meeting developed, and it was translated for me, was that as the government negotiator got more and more uncomfortable and wanted to leave, people insisted on keeping the talking going, even though there was anger and aggression expressed. The government negotiators finally said they had to leave. They had to take their plane and get out. They had other meetings to go to. And Cree and the community wouldn't let them go until they provided a date they would return. And 2 other communities said they were wanted and they should come to the other communities when they came north as well. Despite the breaking down of communication, there was an insistent and general Cree consensus that the government negotiators had to stay in relationships to the Cree. The government negotiator had to agree to come back. This context helps to explore and clarify relational power. Cree insistence on continuing to talk was based on the knowledge that even in the midst of failure and of governments acting in socially irresponsible ways, relationships still exist. Developers' actions still affect the Crees, and this would continue even if they broke the talking and the relationships of speech and dialogue. They were in the relationships nevertheless. Furthermore, since many Crees saw sharing the land, relationships needed to be developed in a way that expressed that sharing because it was their obligation to the animals who were also being affected. And people said, the poor animals. Political strategies and negotiations couldn't be isolated from relationships to land and water and animals. To think one can cut oneself off and ignore these relationships was to endanger yourself in the Cree view. This came out in another dialogue. During discussions of forestry and its effects, Waswanipi hunters, I was talking to Waswanipi hunters by telephone, a hunter, and I said that the Cree had a court case, and that maybe it was time to break off the discussions with the government and just pursue the court case. I thought it would create conditions where there might be a greater willingness to talk. He supported the discussions with the government, but he did not think, he challenged the idea that it was a good idea to break off discussions. He said the government blamed us for moose declines, but the moose are really moving out. They're moving north where there's less disturbance. They're moving from areas disturbed by forestry. They're not being overkilled. He said they shouldn't blame us, and we shouldn't blame the sport hunters either. Don't they, he said, those Cree leaders, and by implication myself, know that we can't protect the land if we only go around blaming each other and accusing them. His comment indicated that it was necessary to continue to seek relationships even as they were not working, because only with such relationships could the animals and the land be effectively cared for. Only in relationships can there be the power that animals and land and people together can create. Cutting off communications denies the relationships, as I've said, and expresses disrespect. He didn't offer a clear path forward. He didn't have a way to a good solution. What he knew was what had to be done now and continue to be done. He was committed to keeping the relationships, and by doing so, expressing here and now what was needed in the present. For Cree hunters, their opposition to development and at the same time their invitations to relationships are essential. They're not a request, they're not acceptance of failures, they're not acquiescence. It's done very much like a hunter who's starving, which are the stories they told in 1974. It's about the fact that in the face of destruction, the only thing you can do is keep going out and searching for the relationships with animals or other people who can care for you, because you and your family's lives depend on continuing that search. There is no alternative. What's at stake when life is at stake, when severe destruction is at stake, then one must choose to build relationships, whatever the outcome. Some people are reported as starving. Others who told the stories were the ones who were able to survive. But these stories were interesting also because they could be due to the malevolence of other people. Not only other Crees in some of these stories, not only to the difficulty of encountering animals, and the only response to them was to keep. Joe Ottereyes, who told me the stories of being challenged in conflicts, said the only thing to do is to keep going and brush that away. Some commentators note with concern that seeking relationships with developers is a response that can be beneficial to the state and corporations. It's intended to be. If it's beneficial to them, it's part of building a relationship. The relational power expressed here is everywhere and continually emerging. But unlike many ways of thinking and enacting power, it focuses on the agentive. The anticipation has to be enacted. The hunter who is starving has to go out on the hunt. It is generative of action and relationships. And I think it's a real force against passivity, against defeat, against compliance, against one's will. That's relational power. It's a form of conduct that's hard to reduce, that's hard to control. As I've aged and retired, all of the material that Waswanipi people and Cree people have shared with me as its future and its uses have become mutual concerns. And so a whole series of dialogues and reflections have developed about how to do that. I and Cree people I've been working most closely with on this have been involved in it now for 5 or 6 years, and it's slowly starting to come together. It raised at first some really interesting challenges that I might mention briefly. Some of my early field notes, the ones I've talked about from 1968 and 70, are deposited at the Canadian Museum of History, as it's called now. They helped to fund my research at that time. Everything worked very modestly at that time, but it worked. And so several decades ago, copies of my field notes were deposited there, but they were held under a clause that said anyone who wanted to see them would have to see me or to get approval. Now as I'm thinking about the longer term, I've deposited the originals there, and the question has come up now: what are the rules for access to this? It was interesting because there's the ethnographer, the way many museums work, can, or the co-researcher, can stipulate conditions. But what should those conditions be? And furthermore, what was the intention 4 decades ago when this information was shared with me, when such intimate information and detailed information was shared? And as I thought it through, I realized that on a few occasions when topics like that had come up, people said, you can share it with others. When I would ask them, you can share it with others. We gave it to you to use. We gave it to you to pass on. And I realized that archiving this was like passing it on. And what occurred was the idea that what an institution should take on, if it's not, what an institution should take on is the kind of relationship I felt I had to the people who gave this to me. That is, I should pass on the same relationship, which is a relationship of you can use it, but if you have doubts about whether this is going to be abused, the key word again is probably respect. If it's not clear it's going to be respectfully used, because I think that's what Cree were saying to me. Use it respectfully or don't use it. And I think that was the implicit agreement back in the 60s and 70s. And I realized that one way to deal with that was to create agreements with the institutions that might hold it, that they could share it. They didn't have to go back to people for every detailed use, but that they should have a way of going back to families and or communities when there were questions, when it was not clear that the use was something that would be respectful of people in the community. And that led to many drafts over a couple of years trying to put that into a form that an institution would agree to. And that although I think there was sympathy among many people in some of the institutions involved, it was not just one. It also, we live in a time when that kind of both legal relationship, to the extent it would be legal, and also resources that were implied in having the resources to do that, were not obviously going to be available. At that time, the Harper government was cutting back on all kinds of museum and archive funding. And one had to take that into account. I still think it's the right way to go. In a sense, the problem, a way to solve it was suggested by one of the archivists. And that was that there was now a Cree museum. It was at Ojibougamoo. And that the National Museum and the Cree Museum could jointly share the material, so that there would be a way of either of them thinking they needed more consultation to go back to communities readily. And so it was agreed, because I was also depositing other things at the Cree Cree Cultural Institute, I'll talk about in a minute, that they could share their respective holdings and share the consultative processes on this. And so a more interesting solution evolved because the Cree now had their own institutions. And that made sense in terms that all of the things that were not really, that might be used by Cree institutions directly, like all of the quantitative material, all of the material related to work in communities related to the James Bay Agreement, that material should go directly to the Cree Cultural Institute. And indeed, they also became the depository for the original copies of the Shaking Tent material. But in all these cases, they both had copies when they wanted it, of the sections they wanted. And furthermore, copies went back to Waswanipi, because Waswanipi was envisaging creating its own archive. And I worked closely with Sam Seagull, who's become the local historian at Waswanipi, to bring these copies into Waswanipi as well. So we ended up with a kind of solution in which the copies are widely distributed. They share with each other, and the rights, if someone really needs rights to them, they have to go to the primary institution, and that institution can call on the others to work out a proper solution for that. So it's been, it's interesting how relationality has turned out to be the solution, not so much illegal drafting. That for the future, you can count much better on archivists and working together than on trying to write a text that will somehow work 40 years from now, which is one of the lessons of the James Bay Agreement, I think. This has also worked partly because of the extraordinary interest of Sam Seagull at Waswanipi. And Sam and Jasmine Habib and I and Philip Owashish have been working for a similar number of years, actually a bit longer, on projects of co-authoring and coordinating our work, talking to each other about it, sharing it, learning from each other, meeting regularly. And this has been an extraordinarily productive process. It doesn't depend on sort of a fieldwork process. It's just, it's been funded by SSHRC for a long time. That funding is now over. But in general, we're continuing it now on our own funding. It's been so productive. And out of that emerged specific projects, so that Sam Gull is now beginning to write a history of Waswanipi. And so we collaborate on that. He can ask us about where he can find information. We can try and get information for him. We can share things we've written with him. And he can share when he wants things he's written with us. And we found it to be an extraordinarily productive way of just turning these relationships into part of everyday practice as professionals, rather than events that happen when we're specially doing research. And I think that's the lesson of it. There's also a lot of lessons that we're all very busy. It all takes a lot of time to do, and we keep working at it. It becomes a kind of enduring relationship.